I have always been a bit of a neat freak. You can ask my wife. I kind of habitually am always straightening things, whether it be placemats or furniture or wall hanging, blankets, clothes. I think I might even have a mild case of OCD, but I am always habitually organizing and straightening things. I suppose there are worse things that you could do with your time, but for me, sometimes it gets a little out of hand. Uh, I can recall a number of times in which I've had important projects to work on, but I couldn't actually sit down to work on them until I had arranged things and cleaned up my workspace. See, for me, I have a real tough time focusing if I'm in a cluttered environment. Now, what does that have to do with our passage today? Well, maybe a few things. Let's read the first part again. And I'll actually start in verse 15, even though our lectionary passage only begins in verse 16. I want us to get a little bit more context of what's going on in our passage. Paul says, "But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast." So what is he talking about? What rights? Well, he's referring to the rights that he would be able to enjoy or privileges that he could exercise as someone who was working on behalf of the gospel. He's essentially citing the law that the people should provide for him as he is a prophet of God. But he's saying, I don't want to exercise these rights. I don't want to use these rights. I'm not even looking for compensation from you, this community that he's writing to, this group of new Christians in the city of Corinth, which is ultimately where we get the letter that becomes 1 Corinthians. It's a letter from Paul to this community after they've written to him and asked him these various questions. He is responding to one of them in particular, and he references these rights that he has as someone who shares the gospel. But he says, I don't want to use these rights. I don't want anything to rob me of this ability to boast. But when it comes to preaching, I don't boast. Yet when I preach the gospel, verse 16, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make use of my rights in preaching it. So he's saying, I would be able to receive money for what I'm doing. I would be able to receive money from you, this group at Corinth. But he's saying, I don't want to do that. I don't want anything to get in the way of what's going on here. Paul doesn't want the money or the prospect of money to clutter or to muddy the waters of this compulsion that he has to preach the gospel and to preach the good news. That's a challenge for Paul. Paul becomes a tent maker to support himself as he is continuing to minister. Even today, there is sometimes a suspicion when we talk about televangelists that they are in ministry as a profession to make money. That is the chief purpose, the chief priority, to make money. I mean, you can look at newspapers and comb the internet for so many televangelists who have gotten in trouble, who've kind of rubbed people the wrong way because of the things that they had, numerous mansions and private jets. And that's a kind of a trope, a cliche, the televangelist who is just in it for the money. Paul says, I don't want there to be any confusion, any lack of clarity as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. I don't want anything to be cluttering what's happening here. I do what I do because I'm compelled to do what I do. Now maybe you're saying, well, chaplain, don't you get paid? Yeah, I get paid, but I would do this part for free. Preaching, teaching the gospel, caring for people, I do that for free. It's the administrative duties that I think of when I think of what I get paid for. But this part, I do this part for free. So let's move on. Next part of our passage is where we really start to get into a different kind of conversation. Verse 19. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. Okay, so Paul mentions what it appears to be 4 different groups. We have the Jews, we have those under the law, we have those not having the law, and we have the weak. Now, what is Paul saying here? We need to kind of understand the groups that he's talking about. Well, commentators seem to think that it's really not 4 groups, it's really 3 groups. Commentators tend to think that the Jews and those under the law is the same group. Paul was a Jew, and in Jewish culture, we've talked about this before, how religious life and cultural life were virtually synonymous. So to be a Jew was to be religious because you were participating in the Jewish religion. So ethnicity, cultural, religion, that was all kind of melded into one thing. I know for us as Americans, we tend to tease that out. There's different religions that are kind of included. There's lots of different cultural influences because in America we are a big melting pot. And there's kind of a lot that goes along with that. But in the Jewish culture, there really wasn't much ethnic diversity. And there wasn't much cultural diversity, and there certainly wasn't much religious diversity. Everything was within the Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, for the most part. So Paul mentions the Jews. Jewish religious life was very much determined by the law, which had a lot of do's and don'ts and specific guidelines having to do with the type of food that they eat, the type of clothes that they would wear, grooming, cleansing, different rules for sacrifices, what to sacrifice for what purpose, when to sacrifice it, different gatherings and feasts to participate in, and your piety or devotion to religion or to God was kind of measured by your adherence to the law. And so Paul is saying to the Jews, these people who are under the law, I became as one under the law. Now he is important to point out that he says, I myself am not under the law. Like, objectively speaking, I'm not under that law, but I participated as one who was in an effort to share the gospel to this group of people. But then he mentions the second group, those not having the law. Now, essentially, he's referring to the Gentiles. In the Old Testament, there is essentially two groups of people, Jews and everyone who is not Jews, Gentiles. And he's saying these people don't have the law. They don't have this set of guidelines that governs their diet, their clothing, their cleansing, their religious life, their spirituality. They don't have that law, so there's a lot more diversity, and there's a lot more to each his own. And Paul is saying to gain an opportunity to share the gospel to this group of people, I became like one of these people. And he says, though these people are not under the law, I myself am under Christ's law. Now again, he differentiates that between the law that the first group is under, the Jewish people are under. So he lists these two groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, those having the law, those not having the law. And then he lists this third group, which is interesting. He just says, to the weak, I became weak so as to share the gospel with the weak. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't use the inverse. He doesn't talk about the strong. It's not some dichotomy to include everyone. He's not saying the weak and the strong, the young and the old, the fast and the slow. He's not saying that. He's talking about this particular group of people, the weak. And commentators seem to think that this is a reference to new Christians. That new Christians are navigating this space of what is their relationship to the law, what guidelines do they follow, what guidelines do they not follow, as they are followers of Christ, but Christianity, especially at the time, very much informed by Jewish customs, Jewish law. And so Paul is referencing this group of people as the weak of conscience, and he's specifically kind of connecting that to a discussion he had earlier in his letter, but we'll talk about that as well. So what is Paul not saying? He lists his three groups, the Jews, the Gentiles, and the weak, and he's saying, I became like all of these people so as to share the gospel with them. But it's important to point out, he doesn't say things like, to the murderer, I became like a murderer. To the thief, I became like a thief. He's not saying, as commentators point out explicitly, he's not advocating some type of moral relativism, that everything is okay, and he's not saying he's some type of social or cultural chameleon. Chameleon is a particular type of lizard, very interesting, but it can kind of change its color to match its surroundings. Paul is not doing that. Paul is not some kind of shapeshifter. Paul is saying, I became like these three groups so as to win people from these three groups. But he's not saying I became like a murderer or like a thief. He's not saying it's okay to do this in interest of winning these people. He's saying something very particular. So what is he really saying? I think he's saying you have to figure out what's most important, and that is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the fact that we are saved by faith and by grace and not by works righteousness. He's saying pursue Christ and Christ alone. Figure out the one thing that you're going to stand for. You know, my high school coach would always say, figure out what you're going to stand for. If you don't stand for something, then you'll fall for anything. I also heard one of my seminary professors explain it like this. Imagine a target. On a target you have concentric circles, meaning circles within side of circles. You have the little circle in the middle, the bullseye. And you have a bigger circle outside of that, and then a bigger circle outside of that, and then so on and so forth. And he drew up on the whiteboard, he drew these circles. And he said, the things in your ministry, figure out where they go. Things like your belief about Jesus Christ, who he is, what he did, put that in the center. But other things like the color of the carpet, maybe that doesn't go in the middle. Maybe that goes out here on the outside. And as you move from the center outside of the circle to each level of the circle, as you move to the outer circles, the particular topics, they become more negotiable, less important. Again, the color of the carpet, I don't think is a salvation issue. Your belief about angels and demons, I don't think that's a salvation issue. I think that's what Paul is doing similarly here as he's talking about these groups. Whether you're adhering to the Jewish customs, what to wear, what to eat, how to bathe, what to sacrifice, when to sacrifice, what gatherings to participate in. I think Paul says that's not a salvation issue. That's something on the outside ring. Also, to those who don't have the law, who essentially wear what they wear, eat what they eat, I think that's an issue out here. Now again, this is very similar to what he did in chapter 8. We talked about that last week. And we've talked about this similar idea before. So Paul in chapter 8 is talking about meat sacrificed to idols. Now again, that's not really an issue that we deal with, but I think the essence of how Paul deals with that issue is instructive for us. Basically, he says, as Christians, we're free to do what we will do. And so whether you abstain from meat sacrificed to idols or whether you participate in eating meat sacrificed to idols, it doesn't really matter. What matters is your freedom in Christ and how you use that freedom. Ultimately, Paul says, use that freedom for the benefit of your fellow believer. Use your freedom for the benefit of someone else. If someone else is impacted negatively by you eating meat sacrificed to idols, then maybe don't do it. But otherwise, whether you eat it or not eat it, it doesn't really matter. That's not the central issue. Eating meat sacrificed to idols is out here. Again, it's an issue of conscience. When Paul references this third group, the weak, he's talking about them being weak in conscience. Again, new Christians who are navigating this new reality of what do they do and not do? What guidelines do they follow? What guidelines do they ignore? That our freedom in Christ should not be used in a boastful way, but in a way that is respectful and mindful of those around us who are also kind of navigating these new issues. So Paul says in chapter 8, this conversation about food sacrificed to idols, it doesn't really matter what you do with regard to this topic. And he's saying something really similar. Following the Jewish customs, not following the Jewish customs, it doesn't really matter. Figure out what's in the center of that circle. And for Paul, it's the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the fact that Jesus died for us on a cross to restore our relationship with God. The color of the carpet, what you believe about this or that. It's not that important. But figure out what's in the center. Figure out how to declutter your faith, declutter your spirituality to get to what's ultimately important. For Paul, that's Christ. So my question for you is, what's in the center of your circle?